Hi, my name is Caleb Rivers, and this is the hardest story I've ever had to tell. It's about how the Riverside Police in California used me as bait to catch my classmates. It's about how my condition Asperger's syndrome made me the perfect target for a cruel police operation. And it's about how I almost lost everything for something every person on the autism spectrum desperately wants: a friend. I'm 22 now, but when this happened, I was 18. It feels like a lifetime ago, yet the scars are still there. Sometimes I wake up and, for a split second, forget that Dan never really existed. For a moment, I still feel that warm sense of having someone who cared about me. Before I dive in, you need to understand something about being autistic. It's not like the movies. I'm not a math genius who can calculate impossible numbers. I don't have superpowers. What I have is a different way of seeing the world, and it makes me vulnerable in ways neurotypical people can't fully grasp. When you're autistic, social rules are like a foreign language everyone speaks fluently, except you. You spend your whole life trying to decode codes that seem obvious to everyone else. And when someone finally seems to speak your language, when someone finally seems to accept you, well, you'd do anything to keep that person. This is the story of how that vulnerability nearly destroyed my life. It was 2012, my senior year at Chaparral High School in Riverside. For most of my classmates, this should have been the best year of their lives. Proms, graduations, first loves, last adventures before adulthood. For me, it was just another year trying to stay invisible. You need to understand what my social life was like back then. Picture waking up every day knowing you're about to spend 8 hours in a place where you don't know the rules, where every social interaction feels like a test you always fail, where the school bell makes you flinch, not because it signals the end of class, but because it means you have to navigate crowded hallways without having a sensory meltdown. I didn't choose to be alone. Loneliness was chosen for me. A mix of neurological differences and a teen social system with zero patience for people who are different. Every morning, I'd arrive at school exactly at 7:45 a.m., not 7:44, not 7:46 to 7:45 sharp. Predictability was my anchor in a world that seemed to constantly change the rules. I'd go straight to my locker, grab my books for the first class, and walk the halls with my head down. Other students existed around me like ghosts. I'd hear them laughing, chatting, flirting, planning weekends I'd never be invited to. Sometimes I'd stop and just watch groups of friends interacting, trying to figure out what made them click so naturally. "Hey Caleb," a voice would occasionally shout. My heart would jump with hope, thinking someone finally wanted to talk to me. But when I turned, it was always someone calling another Caleb, or worse, someone mocking me. "Caleb, the weirdo," they'd say, and their friends would laugh. I learned not to turn when I heard my name. In class, I always sat in the front row. Not because I was a teacher's pet, but because it meant fewer people staring at me. Fewer chances to misread a facial expression or miss an inside joke. Teachers liked me because I always did my homework and never caused trouble. But they didn't understand why I struggled with group work or oral presentations. "Caleb, why don't you join Sarah's group?" Mrs. Wilson would ask in math class, always smiling encouragingly, as if the only thing stopping me from making friends was lack of opportunity. I'd nod and whisper that I preferred to work alone. The truth was, the thought of joining a group of strangers made me physically sick. My hands would sweat, my heart would race, and I'd feel like everyone in the room was watching and judging me. Lunch was the worst. 30 minutes of free time that felt like 30 minutes of being reminded that I had no one to sit with. I always brought my own lunch. The cafeteria food was unpredictable, and any change in my eating routine made me anxious for the rest of the day. I'd sit at the same table every day, in the corner of the cafeteria, back to the wall. From there, I could observe the entire social ecosystem of the school. The cheerleaders in their shiny uniforms, always laughing at things I didn't understand. The jocks in their Letterman jackets, talking about games and parties. The nerds, who ironically never accepted me, because I was too weird even for them. And then there were the groups I couldn't even categorize, those fluid clusters of people who seemed to navigate between cliques effortlessly. I envied them more than anyone else. How did they do it? How did they know when it was okay to make a joke, when to be serious, how to read the mood of a room? Sometimes a girl named Brittany would walk past my table with her friends. She was popular, pretty, the kind of person who seemed born knowing how to work the social world. "That's the weird kid in my history class," I'd hear her whisper. "He, like, never talks to anyone. Kind of creepy, right?" Her friend would reply. I pretended not to hear, but every word felt like a little stab. They didn't know I had particularly sharp hearing, one of the gifts of my condition. I heard every whisper, every giggle as they passed by. Afternoons were slightly better because classes were more structured. There were clear rules, defined expectations. I could lose myself in math equations or history essays, worlds where logic mattered more than charisma. But even in class, I was constantly reminded of my difference. When a teacher made a joke, everyone laughed except me, not because it wasn't funny, but because I processed humor differently. When they used sarcasm, I took it literally. When they referenced pop culture, I was lost. "Caleb, are you with us?" Mr. Peterson asked once in English class after I completely missed a discussion about metaphors in a poem. Physically, I was there, but mentally, I was in my own world, trying to figure out why everyone thought comparing love to a red rose was deep. After school, I went straight home. No sports teams, clubs, or extracurricular activities for me. I'd tried joining the chess club once, thinking other nerds might accept me, but even there, I was the odd one out. They made inside jokes about movies and TV shows I hadn't seen, and when I tried to contribute strategies, they looked at me like I was a robot. At home, I'd retreat to my room. My parents, Carol and David, were loving and did their best to understand me, but they didn't know how to help. They saw me struggling socially and worried, but any attempt to encourage me to go out more or make friends only made me feel worse. "Caleb, honey, don't you want to try talking to some classmates?" My mom would ask sometimes at dinner. "I do." I'd lie. "People are just busy." My dad tried a different approach. "When I was your age, I joined the baseball team. How about you try a sport?" The thought of being in an even more social environment, where physical coordination was also required, made me panic. "I'd rather study," I'd reply. They'd exchange those looks parents give when they love their child but don't know what to do. Looks full of love, but also helplessness. At night, in my room, I'd lose myself in video games and books, worlds with clear rules, where I could be heroic, where I had control. In RPGs, I could be a leader, make important decisions, have companions who respected me. In sci-fi, I could imagine worlds where being different was an advantage, not a curse. But even these refuges were lonely. I played single-player games because online gaming made me anxious. I read alone because I had no one to discuss books with. I wrote stories in a notebook I never showed anyone. Sometimes, late at night, I'd look out my window and see other houses in the neighborhood. Through lit windows, I could see families eating together, laughing, talking. I'd wonder what it would be like to have siblings, cousins my age, anyone who understood me. I fantasized about having a best friend, someone who understood my obsessions, didn't judge my quirks, who wanted to spend time with me not out of pity, but by choice. Someone I could be completely myself with. This fantasy felt so real that sometimes I practiced conversations in the mirror, imagining telling someone about my day, my thoughts, my dreams. I practiced jokes, probably not funny, and interesting stories, probably boring to normal people. I didn't know then that this vulnerability, this desperate need for connection would make me the perfect target for predators posing as friends. By the end of my junior year, I'd resigned myself to the idea that maybe I was destined to be lonely. Maybe some people just weren't meant to have friends. Maybe I should accept it and focus on other things: studies, college, a career where I could function better on my own. But then September 2012 came, my senior year, and everything changed, or at least I thought it did. That's when I met Dan. It was a Tuesday in September. I remember it exactly because Tuesdays were my favorite days. I had calculus in the morning, my strongest subject, and then PE at the end of the day, which at least meant the worst was over. I was at my locker, organizing my books with the obsessive care people like me tend to have. Every book had its exact spot, every notebook perfectly aligned. It was 8:23 a.m. I always arrived at my locker at exactly that time. "Hey, you're Caleb, right?" I turned, expecting to see another student making a joke about weird Caleb or telling me to get out of the way. Instead, I saw a guy my age, maybe a little older, with a genuinely friendly smile. He was tall, with messy brown hair that somehow looked deliberately casual. Dressed like any other student: jeans, t-shirts, sneakers. "Yes," I replied, automatically suspicious. People didn't talk to me unless they wanted something. "I'm Dan," he said, extending his hand. "Dan Zipkin, I just transferred here." I stared at the outstretched hand for a moment. Physical contact was always difficult for me, but there was something about the way he carried himself that seemed safe. I shook his hand quickly. "Nice to meet you," Dan continued. "You seem like an interesting guy, different from the other kids here." My heart jumped. Someone had called me interesting. Not weird, not strange, but interesting. "Thanks," I muttered, unsure how to respond to what sounded like a genuine compliment. "Man, this place is kind of intense, huh?" Dan said, glancing around the crowded hallway. "All the cliques, all the social pressure. It's refreshing to meet someone who seems real." I didn't know what to say. No one had ever described me as real before. In fact, I often felt like I was the only fake person in school, pretending to understand conversations and jokes that flew completely over my head. "Wanna grab lunch together today?" Dan asked. "I'm still figuring this place out, and you seem like someone who knows where the quiet spots are." I stayed silent for a moment, processing what had just happened. Someone wanted to have lunch with me. Someone voluntarily wanted to spend time with me. "Sure," I finally said. I usually sit in the cafeteria in the corner." "Perfect." Dan smiled. See you there at noon. He walked off, waving casually, and I stood there for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. I had a social appointment. For the first time in, well, maybe ever in my life. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on class because my mind was racing with possibilities and anxieties. What would I say to Dan? What if I said something weird and he realized I wasn't interesting, just strange? What if this was some kind of cruel joke? But there was also a feeling I'd never experienced before. Anticipation. Not pure anxiety, but a mix of nervousness and excitement. I was going to lunch with someone. I was going to have a voluntary social interaction. When the lunch bell rang at 12:05, I headed straight for the cafeteria. I got to my usual table and waited, obsessively checking the clock. 12:07. Las 12:08. Las 12:09. What if he didn't come? What if he changed his mind? At 12:11, I saw Dan enter the cafeteria. He scanned the room, saw me, and smiled, not a forced or polite smile, but a smile that genuinely looked happy to see me. Caleb, he said, walking toward the table with a tray. Hope you don't mind if I brought school lunch. Still figuring out how things work around here. That's fine, I said, trying to sound casual. I usually bring my own. School food is unpredictable. Dan laughed, not in a mocking way, but understanding. Man, I totally get it. Routine changes are tough, huh? I froze. How did he know? How did he understand something I'd never verbalized to anyone? Yeah, I said cautiously. Exactly that. Dan sat across from me and popped open his soda. So, Caleb, tell me about yourself. What do you like to do? It was a simple question, but no one had ever asked me that before. At least, not in a way that sounded genuinely interested in the answer. I like video games, I said hesitantly. Mostly RPGs, and I read a lot of sci-fi. Sometimes I do computer programming as a hobby. I braced myself for him to say it was nerdy or boring, like other students always did. Instead, Dan leaned forward, genuinely curious. Dude, that's awesome. What kind of programming? And which RPGs do you play? For 30 minutes, we talked about video games, technology, and even some books we'd both read. Dan didn't just pay attention, he asked smart questions, shared his own experiences, and genuinely seemed interested in my hobbies. You're really smart, Caleb, he said at one point, and interesting. Too bad most people in this school are too shallow to notice. I felt my face flush. No one had ever called me smart in a way that sounded like a genuine compliment. In school, being smart often isolated me even more. Thanks, I muttered. Seriously, man. Most kids our age just want to talk about sports, girls, or parties. It's refreshing to talk to someone with deeper thoughts. When the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, I felt a pang of sadness. The conversation had flown by, and for the first time in years, I didn't want a social period to end. Hey, Dan said, standing up. How about we do this again tomorrow? Really? I asked, unable to hide my excitement. Of course. And maybe you can show me some of those games you mentioned. You got an Xbox? I do, I said quickly. Would you want to come over sometime? I couldn't believe I had just invited someone to my house. That had never happened before. That'd be awesome, Dan smiled. How about Friday after school? The rest of that week felt different from any week of my life. I had something to look forward to. Every day, Dan and I had lunch together, and our conversations grew more natural, deeper. He told me about his old school, about how hard it was being the new kid. I talked about my hobbies, and for the first time, someone actually seemed interested. More than that, Dan stood up for me. One day, Brittany and her friends walked past our table, and one of them made a comment about the weird kid club that had formed in the cafeteria corner. "Hey," Dan said loudly enough for them to hear, "at least we have interesting conversations. You guys just talk about who's dating who." They were shocked and, a little embarrassed and, quickly walked away. No one had ever defended me before. "Thanks," I whispered to Dan. "Man, no need to thank me. That's what friends do, friends." He had used the word friends. I had a friend. On Friday, Dan came over to my house after school. I was nervous. No one my age had ever been in my room. Would he think my sci-fi posters were childish? And my collection of books, organized by author and then by publication date? But Dan seemed genuinely impressed. "Man, your room is awesome. Look at all these books. And you've got a serious gaming setup here." We played video games for hours. Dan was good, but not in a competitive way that made me anxious. He asked about strategies, complimented my skills, and genuinely seemed to be having fun. "Caleb," he said at one point, pausing the game, "I gotta tell you something. You're the first real friend I've made at this school. Everyone here is so fake, but you're authentic." I didn't know how to respond. My chest was tight with emotion, a good emotion for the first time in a long time. "You're my first real friend too," I admitted. "Actually, you're my first friend, period." Dan looked at me with an expression I interpreted as compassion and understanding. "Man, that's sad. You deserve friends. You're an amazing person." At that moment, sitting in my room with Dan, I felt something I'd never felt before: belonging. I wasn't the weird kid eating alone anymore. I was Caleb, Dan's smart, interesting friend. If I had known then what I know now, I might have noticed some strange things: how Dan always asked a lot of questions about other students, how he seemed particularly interested in who used drugs at school, how he never talked much about his own family or old school. But I was so desperate for friendship, so grateful to finally have someone who accepted me, that I ignored every warning sign. Dan was my friend, my first real experience of social connection, and I would do anything to keep that friendship, anything. That vulnerability, my desperate need to hold on to my first and only friendship, was exactly what Dan was counting on. Because Dan wasn't really an 18-year-old transfer student. Dan was Officer Daniel Zipkin, 22, from the Riverside Police Department, and I wasn't his friend. I was his target. About a month had passed since I met Dan, and I was living a completely different life. For the first time, I actually looked forward to going to school. I had someone to talk to in the hallways, someone who saved me a spot at lunch, someone who genuinely seemed to care about what I had to say. My parents noticed the change. "Caleb, you seem happier," my mom said one evening at dinner. "This new friend Dan seems like a positive influence. He's amazing," I replied. And it was true, or at least I thought it was true. "He really gets me." My dad smiled. "It's good to see you with a friend, son. Maybe you could bring him over for dinner sometime." I was excited at the idea. Having Dan meet my parents would somehow legitimize our friendship. It would be proof that this was real, lasting. It was a Thursday in October when things started to change. Dan and I were in my room after school, playing a new RPG I had bought. He seemed a little different that day, restless, less focused on the game. "Hey Caleb," he finally said, pausing the game. "Can I ask you a favor?" "Sure," I said immediately. It was the first time Dan had asked me to do something specific for him, and I was eager to help. "Anything." Dan looked slightly embarrassed, which was unusual for him. "It's kind of, I don't know, weird to ask, and if you're not comfortable, just tell me, okay?" "Dan, we're friends. You can ask me anything." He took a deep breath. "Okay, so do you know anyone who could get, well, marijuana?" It felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. "Drugs." Dan was asking me about drugs. I've never used drugs," I said quickly. "My parents always told me drugs are dangerous, and I really never thought about it." No, man," Dan said quickly. "I'm not asking you to use. Definitely not. It's just, look, it's kind of awkward, but my older brother is coming to visit this weekend, and he kind of expects me to have access to this stuff. You know how older brothers are. I didn't, actually. I was an only child, but I wanted to seem understanding. So you don't want to use IS?" "Of course not. It's more about, I don't know, impressing my brother, showing I can get stuff." "It's stupid, I know." Dan seemed genuinely embarrassed and vulnerable. It was the first time I had seen him like that, and it made me want to help him even more. "Well," I said slowly, "there's a guy in my PE class, Tyler. I've heard him talking about stuff with other guys in the locker room." "Really?" Dan looked relieved. "Do you think you could maybe ask him?" "I'd pay, of course. I don't want you spending your own money." I hesitated. The whole situation made me uncomfortable, not because I had anything against marijuana specifically, I didn't really know much about it, but because it meant putting myself in a socially awkward position with Tyler, who barely spoke to me even under the best circumstances. "I don't know, Dan. Tyler and I aren't exactly close." "I get it," Dan said quickly. "And if you're not comfortable with it, that's fine. It's just, man, you're the only person I trust at this school. Everyone else is so fake, but you're genuine. I knew if anyone could help me, it would be you." That hit me right in my weak spot. Dan trusted me. He saw me as special, genuine. I was the only person he trusted. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll try talking to Tyler, but I can't promise anything, Caleb. Man, you're the best friend anyone could have. Seriously." He hugged me quickly. Genuine warm hug. I wasn't good with physical contact, but coming from Dan, it felt right. The following Friday, I forced myself to talk to Tyler in the locker room after PE. My hands were sweating, and I had rehearsed the conversation in my head at least 20 times. "Hey Tyler," I said, trying to sound casual. He looked at me in surprise. "Rivers, what the hell do you want?" I swallowed hard. Tyler was intimidating, big, muscular, with a reputation for getting into trouble. A friend of mine is looking for, well, marijuana." Tyler studied me for a moment. "Your friend? Since when do you have friends, Rivers?" "I have a friend now," I said defensively. "Dan. He's new at school, huh?" Tyler seemed to consider it. "And why can't your friend get his own weed? He's new. Doesn't know anyone yet." Tyler laughed. "And he sent you to me because you're so popular." I felt my face flush. He knows I don't use, but thought maybe I knew someone. Interesting, Tyler said, still studying me. How much is your friend willing to pay? He didn't say a specific amount. $50 for an eighth. Take it or leave it. $50. That was more money than I usually carried, but Dan had said he would pay. Okay, I said. When can you get it? Monday. Meet me here after class. Over the weekend. I told Dan I had talked to Tyler. Caleb, you're amazing, he said, giving me another quick hug. $50, no problem. Here's the money. He pulled a $50 bill from his wallet and handed it to me. It was more cash than I normally saw a high school student carrying, but I didn't think much of it at the time. On Monday, I was nervous all day. During PE, I could barely focus on the activities. After class, while other students left the locker room, I waited for Tyler. Rivers, he said, when most of the other guys had gone. You brought the money. I nodded and handed over the 50. Tyler looked around to make sure we were alone, then pulled a small plastic bag from his locker. Here, he said, pushing the bag into my hand. And Rivers, you never saw me. Got it. Got it, I muttered, shoving the bag into my pocket quickly. I left the locker room with my heart racing. I had just bought drugs. I, Caleb Rivers, the kid who had never broken a rule in my life, had just committed a federal crime, but I had also helped my friend, and that seemed more important. I met Dan in the parking lot after school. Got it? He asked. I pulled the small bag from my pocket and handed it to him discreetly. Caleb, man, you're the best. Seriously, my brother's gonna be impressed. Dan quickly stashed the bag in his backpack. He looked different, relieved, but also calculating. I didn't know how to read the expression on his face. So, how was it? Tyler treat you? Okay, he was. Tyler, I said. Kind of rude, but he did what he promised. Good to know, Dan said, and I could see him processing that information carefully. For a few days, everything returned to normal. Dan and I had lunch together, played video games, talked about movies and books. I almost forgot about the marijuana incident. Almost. But then, the following Thursday, Dan made another request. Hey Caleb, he said during lunch. Can I ask you for another favor? My stomach twisted. What kind of favor? Well, my brother liked the quality last time so much that he wants to buy more. But he's also looking for something a little different. What do you mean? Dan looked around to make sure no one was listening. He was asking if Tyler could get other stuff too. Maybe something a bit stronger. Dan, I don't know. This is starting to feel... I know, he said quickly. Look, I understand if you don't want to get involved again. It's just... Man, my brother is really impressed with me for the first time in my life. And you're the only person who can help me with this. Once again, he was appealing to our special bond. I was the only person who could help him. Our friendship meant I had a responsibility to him. What kind of stuff does he want? Maybe cocaine? Or pills? Something that will really impress his friends. Cocaine. The word sent a chill down my spine. This was way beyond marijuana. This was heavy drugs, the kind that ruined lives. Dan, that's really serious. Cocaine can kill people. I know it sounds scary, he said. But look, my brother is an adult. He knows what he's doing. And it's not like we'd use it's just business, you know. I don't know if Tyler can get that kind of stuff. could you ask? Please look. If he can't, that's fine. But just try, please. For me? He gave me those puppy dog eyes that always worked on me. And once again, despite every instinct screaming that this was wrong, I gave in. Okay, I'll ask. But if Tyler says no, that's it. Okay. Of course, man. And Caleb, thanks. You really are the best friend anyone could have. The following weeks fell into a pattern I didn't recognize as manipulation at the time. Don made requests that were increasingly specific and risky, always framed as favors for his brother, or as temporary situations that would soon be over. Tyler, for his part, was more than willing to expand our business. When I asked about cocaine, he laughed. Rivers, you're full of surprises. Your little friend wants to play with the big kids, huh? It's for his brother, I explained quickly. Of course it is, Tyler said with a cynical smile. Cocaine will cost $300 and I'll need the money up front. $300. More money than I had. When I told Dan, he didn't hesitate. No problem here. He pulled $300 bills from his wallet. Again, I thought it was odd for a high school student to have so much cash, but Dan always had plausible explanations. My brother gave me some money in advance, he'd say. Or, I have a part-time job. Or, my parents give me a generous allowance. Each transaction made me more anxious, but also more involved. It was like I was going down a slope and couldn't stop. Dan always reassured me, always made me feel special, like our friendship was worth these small risks. Caleb, man, you're the only person at school I trust, he would say after every favor. Everyone else is fake, but you're real. And I believed him. More than that, I needed to believe him. The alternative that I might be being used was unthinkable. Dan was my first friend, my first experience of social acceptance. I would do anything to keep that. The drugs I was facilitating were also becoming more dangerous. After the cocaine, Dan asked for ecstasy. After that, prescription pills, OxyContin, Adderall, Xanax. Tyler seemed to have connections for everything, and Dan always had the money. I tried not to think about where the drugs were going. Dan said it was all for his brother and his brother's friends, adults who knew what they were doing. I told myself I was just a middleman, not really responsible for what happened afterward. But I was becoming paranoid. I constantly looked over my shoulder in the school hallways, convinced someone knew what I was doing. I had nightmares about getting caught, about my parents finding out, about losing everything. Dan, I said one day, I think we should stop. This is getting too risky. I know, man, I know, he said, placing a hand on my shoulder in a gesture meant to be comforting. But that was starting to feel calculated. Just a few more times, okay. My brother is almost done with his college semester, and after that, he won't need this stuff anymore. Your brother is in college. Yeah, he's older. Grad school, you know how grad students are, lots of stress, lots of pressure. It was a plausible explanation, but something about it bothered me. Dan had never mentioned specific details about his family before. What college? Us. See, Dan said quickly. Studying. Business. Again, plausible, but vague. By this point, I was carrying drugs for Dan several times a week. I had essentially become a dealer, though I never thought of it that way. In my mind, I was just helping my friend. Drugs weren't the only strange thing about Dan. The more time we spent together, the more questions he asked about other students at school. "Hey Caleb, that guy Marcus, he seems kind of sketchy, right? Do you think he's into drugs too? Or, Brittany and her friends seem like they party a lot. Do you think they use anything? Or, are there other guys like Tyler at school? Guys who can get stuff?" I answered his questions because, again, they were just conversations between friends. Friends talk about other people, make observations about classmates. It didn't seem strange that Dan was curious about the school's social ecosystem, but Dan was also starting to suggest that I expand my network. "Tyler's great," he said one day, "but it would be good to have other options too. Diversification, you know, other options. Just, if you knew other guys who could get stuff, it would be helpful. Tyler might not always be available." "I don't know other guys, Dan. Tyler was luck. You know Marcus, right? He seems like the type." Marcus was a student in my history class, known for being trouble. He was the type of guy who always seemed involved in sketchy things, but nothing confirmed. "I don't know Marcus personally, but you have a class together, right? Maybe you could, I don't know, strike up a conversation." The idea of approaching Marcus made me uncomfortable. Tyler was intimidating enough, and at least I knew him superficially from PE. Marcus was completely unknown. "I don't know, Dan. That feels forced. It doesn't have to be obvious. Just be friendly. See if a natural conversation happens." Dan was asking me to recruit other dealers. At the time, I didn't think in those terms, but that's what was happening. He was using me to map and access the school's entire drug network. And because I trusted him, because I needed him, I started doing it. Approaching Marcus was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I wasn't good at starting casual conversations with strangers, especially intimidating strangers like Marcus. "Hey Marcus," I said one day after history class. "How's it going?" He looked at me in surprise. "Rivers, since when do you talk to me?" "I just being friendly." "Friendly," he repeated with a cynical smile. Interesting. It took several attempts, but eventually I managed to establish some rapport with Marcus. And as Dan had predicted, Marcus had his own drug connections, some different from Tyler's. "You've got an interesting friend, Rivers," Marcus said, when I finally made my first request. "This Dan seems to have expensive tastes." "It's for his brother," I explained, as always. "Of course it is," Marcus laughed. "Everyone's brother needs drugs, right?" But he made the sale anyway. And after that, Dan had 2 sources instead of 1. That should have made me feel more comfortable, more options, less reliance on Tyler. Instead, it made me more anxious. I was now connected to multiple dealers at school. If anything went wrong, I would be the common link between all of them. And the drugs were getting more exotic, more expensive. Dan started asking for things I had never heard of: ketamine, DMT, even heroin once. "Dan, this is getting really heavy," I said when he mentioned heroin. "I know, man. My brother's going through a really hard time. Relationship problems, school pressure. He just needs something to get through it. Heroin kills people. Dan, he knows the risks. And look, if you're not comfortable, that's fine. I understand." But the way he said it with a tone of disappointment, as if I were failing as a friend, made me cave. "No, it's okay. I just care. I know you care. That's why you're such a good friend." Neither Tyler nor Marcus could get heroin, which was a relief, but Dan had constant requests, and every time I hesitated, He found a way to make me feel guilty, or to reaffirm how special our friendship was. "Caleb, you know you can talk to me about anything, right?" he said one day. "Like if you're feeling overwhelmed or something." "I'm fine," I lied. "It's just, I notice you seem more tense lately. And I don't want our friendship to stress you out." "It's not," I said quickly. The last thing I wanted was for Dan to think our friendship was a problem. "Good. Because, man, you mean a lot to me. Like more than any friend I've ever had." Those words warmed me. Even amid all my anxiety about the drugs, hearing Dan say I mattered to him made it all feel worth it. I didn't know that each of these conversations was carefully orchestrated, that Dan was using psychological manipulation techniques to keep me engaged and obedient, that he was documenting everything I did and said to build a legal case against me and all the other students I was helping connect to him. All I knew was that I finally had a friend, and I would do anything to keep him, even if it meant becoming a criminal. Looking back, there were so many signs that something was wrong with Dan, signs that any neurologically typical person probably would have noticed. But I was so desperate for friendship, so grateful to finally be accepted, that I ignored every red flag. The first sign should have been Dan's age. He said he was 18, but sometimes he seemed older, not physically, but in the way he spoke, moved, and handled situations. There was a maturity in him that didn't match a typical teenager. "Dan, have you ever had a job before?" I asked one day, after noticing how comfortable he seemed talking about money and business. "Some summer jobs," he said vaguely. "You know, typical teen stuff." But when I asked specifically about these jobs, the answers were always vague. "Oh, landscaping. A little office work for my uncle." Never specific details. Never funny stories or particular memories you'd expect from someone talking about real work experiences. Dan also had knowledge about things that seemed strange for a high school student. He knew a lot about the legal system, how the police operated, and the legal consequences of different crimes. "Man, did you know that possession of cocaine is a federal crime?" he said one day, seemingly out of nowhere. "Really?" I replied, immediately concerned. "Yeah, but only if it's over 5 grams. Below that, it's usually treated as a state crime." At the time, I thought it was just general knowledge he'd picked up somewhere. Now I realize he was testing me, seeing if I knew the legal consequences of what I was doing. Another sign was how Dan always seemed to have money. Lots of money. He paid for hundreds of dollars in drugs without hesitation, always had clean, crisp bills, and never seemed worried about spending. "Man, your parents must give you a hefty allowance," I said once, after he pulled $400 from his wallet without flinching. "They want me to have a full school experience," he said. "You know, go out with friends, do stuff." But Dan never hung out with other friends. He never mentioned buying other things with this money. It all seemed to go to drugs. And then there were the constant questions. Dan always wanted to know about other students who was using drugs, who was selling drugs, parties where drugs might be present. "Hey, that party at Brittany's last weekend," he said one day. "Do you think anything went down there? What kind of thing? You know, drugs. Seems like the kind of party where people experiment." "I didn't go to the party." "I know, but did you hear anything? Other guys talking about what happened?" These conversations always made me uncomfortable, but Don framed them as normal gossip between friends. Just curious about what's going on at school, he'd say. Dan also never seemed genuinely interested in the drugs I got for him. He never asked about effects, never seemed excited to use anything, never shared stories about experiences he or his brother had. For someone supposedly facilitating recreational drug use, Dan seemed surprisingly clinical about everything. He wanted to know prices, quantities, sources, but never the experiential side. "How did your brother like that ecstasy last time?" I asked once. "Oh, he liked it," Dan said vaguely. "It was good for him." No story, no detail, no personality in the response. There was also the fact that Dan never invited me to his house. We always met at school or at my house. When I asked about visiting him, there was always an excuse. "My parents are kind of picky about having people over," he said once. "They work a lot and like peace and quiet." Another time, "We're renovating the house. It's a total mess." And another, "My brother's visiting and using the guest room. Not much space." I never pushed because I didn't want to seem needy or intrusive. But it was strange that our friendship was so one-sided in terms of personal space. Dan also never talked about his life outside of school in any specific way. I knew he liked video games because we played together, but he never mentioned playing at home. I knew he had transferred from another school, but details about that school were always vague. "What was your old school like?" I asked once. "Different from this one," he said. "Smaller, less diverse." "Do you miss any friends from there?" "Not really. Most people there were shallow." Always vague answers, always lacking the specific details that make memories real. And there were times when Dan seemed to forget things he had told me before. Small inconsistencies that I noticed but rationalized. "I thought you said your brother was studying business," I said once.
Yeah.
"Business. Specifically, business administration. Before, you said it was just business." "Well, business administration falls under business, right?" Technically true, but evasive. The strangest thing of all was how Dan always seemed to know exactly what to say to keep me engaged. When I expressed doubts, he always had the perfect response. When I seemed hesitant, he always knew how to reel me back in. "Caleb, you know it means a lot to me to have a friend like you, right?" He'd say at the exact moments I was questioning our dynamic. Or, "Man, you're the most genuine person I know. Everyone else at this school is fake, but you're real." It was always the right words, at the right time, said in the right way to make me feel special and valued. One day, I was particularly anxious about a larger transaction. Dan had requested $200 worth of cocaine from Marcus. "Dan, I'm really nervous about this," I said. "What if we get caught?" "Caleb," he said, looking me directly in the eyes with an intensity that seemed genuine, "I would never let anything bad happen to you. We're a team. We take care of each other." In that moment, I felt completely reassured. Dan cared about me. He would protect me. We were a team. Now I realize that these words were specifically calculated to exploit my psychological vulnerability. Dan knew I had never had a friend before. He knew I was desperate for acceptance and belonging. He knew the idea of being part of a team with someone would be irresistible to me. And it worked. Every time I hesitated, every time my instincts told me something was wrong, Don knew exactly how to calm me and keep me in line. He was a professional doing what he had been trained to do, manipulate a vulnerable person to get what he wanted. and I was the perfect target, lonely, desperate, trusting, and neurologically predisposed to interpret his manipulations as genuine friendship. The most obvious sign, which I only see clearly now, was how Dan never seemed particularly interested in me as a person. He asked the right questions, said the right things, but there was never genuine curiosity about my thoughts, dreams, fears, or aspirations. Real friendship involves mutual interest, shared vulnerability, growing together. Our friendship was entirely about what I could do for Dan. He never shared anything real about himself, never asked my advice on personal problems, never showed genuine vulnerability. But I was so grateful for any form of social connection that I interpreted his careful manipulations as signs of a deep friendship. And when it all fell apart, when I discovered who Dan really was, noticing all these signs I had missed was almost more painful than the betrayal itself, because it meant I had been a fool. It meant my first and only experience of friendship had been a lie from day one. And it meant I might never be able to trust my own judgment about people again. It was May 22nd, 2012. A Tuesday. I remember the date exactly because it was the day my life changed forever. I was driving to school that morning, listening to music, and thinking about Dan's plan for us to go to the movies over the weekend. It was something normal friends did, go to the movies together, and I was excited about this next normal step in our friendship. When I arrived at the school parking lot at 7:45 a.m., my usual time, I immediately knew something was very wrong. There were police cars everywhere. Not just one or two, but at least 6 marked vehicles, plus several unmarked cars with antennas screaming federal law enforcement. There were men and women in dark suits with FBI badges, hanging from lanyards around their necks. And there were students being handcuffed. My first thought was that maybe there had been some kind of threat at the school. Shooting, bomb, something like that. My second thought was to find Dan and make sure he was safe. I parked my car and started walking toward the school, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I saw Tyler being pushed into a police vehicle, handcuffed, yelling something I couldn't understand from a distance. Then I saw Marcus being escorted by 2 federal agents. He was handcuffed too, but he looked more resigned than Tyler. Our eyes met for a moment from afar, and the expression on his face was pure anger directed at me. That's when my stomach started to turn. Tyler and Marcus, my 2 drug contacts, both being arrested that same morning. This couldn't be a coincidence. I hid behind a car and pulled out my phone, calling Dan. If the police were arresting drug dealers at school, Dan needed to know. His brother could be in danger if the drugs we had bought were traced to him. The phone rang several times before Dan answered. "Hello," he said, but his voice sounded different, more formal, less warm. "Dan, thank God. Are you okay? There are police all over the school. Tyler and Marcus got arrested." There was a long pause, too long to be natural. "Caleb," Dan finally said, and the tone of his voice made me freeze. "You need to come talk to me. Where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm in the parking lot, near the main entrance. Do you see me?" I looked in the direction he indicated and saw Dan. But he wasn't alone. He was talking to one of the men in suits, and they were smiling at each other, like colleagues, like they knew each other. "Dan," I said into the phone, my voice shaking. "What's happening? Caleb, come over here now." The call ended. I stood there for several minutes, trying to process what my eyes were telling me. Dan was casually talking to federal agents. He didn't look scared or confused. He looked comfortable, like he belonged there. Slowly, as if in a nightmare, I began walking toward Dan. With each step, reality became clearer and impossible to deny. Dan wasn't being interrogated by the agents. He was collaborating with them. When I got close enough to hear, I caught fragments of the conversation. "We've gathered enough evidence against 12 students. Caleb Rivers was especially helpful in mapping the network. Successful operation, Officer Zipkin." Officer Zipkin. Dan was a cop. I stopped walking. I couldn't breathe. The world was spinning around me. Dan saw me approaching and said something to the agent he was speaking with. The agent looked in my direction and nodded. "Caleb," Dan said, walking toward me. But he was no longer the Dan I knew. His body language was different, more confident, more authoritative, older. "You're a police officer," I said. "Not a question." "I'm Officer Daniel Zipkin, Riverside Police Department," he confirmed. "And you need to come with me to the station for questioning." But we're friends," I stammered. It was the only thing my mind could process. Dan looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not cruel exactly, but completely cold. Professional. "Caleb, Dan never existed," he said. "I'm Officer Zipkin, and you are part of an undercover police operation called Operation Glasshouse." Operation Glasshouse. An investigation into drug trafficking at Chaparral High School. You facilitated multiple illegal drug transactions, connecting our operation to sources we would never have found on our own. I felt like I had been hit by a truck. Everything made sense now. Why Dan always asked so many questions about other students, why he always had money, why he never seemed interested in the drugs I got, only in getting them. Why he had become my friend. "You used me," I whispered. "You facilitated federal drug crimes," he replied. "Now you need to come with me." But I thought we were friends. For the first time, I saw what might have been a shadow of genuine emotion on Officer Zipkin's face. But it passed quickly. "Caleb, you have the right to remain silent." He began reading me my Miranda rights while I stood there, in the parking lot of my high school, watching my entire life collapse. I wasn't a criminal being arrested. I was a victim of manipulation. Discovering that my first and only friendship had been a lie orchestrated from the very beginning. The Riverside police station was everything I imagined it would be, but worse. Bright fluorescent lights made my eyes ache. Constant sounds of phones ringing and people talking loudly. Smells of stale coffee and cleaning products that made me nauseous. For someone on the autism spectrum, it was a sensory overload on top of the most devastating emotional trauma of my life. They put me in a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs. The walls were an institutional beige that seemed designed to suck all hope from anyone who entered. There was a small window with bars, and through it I could see the parking lot where my parents would soon be, trying to understand how their son had become a federal criminal. I had been alone in the room for about 20 minutes when the door opened, and a detective walked in, introducing himself as Martinez. He was a middle-aged man with a graying beard and tired eyes that had clearly seen a lot. "Caleb Rivers," he said, consulting a thick file, 18 years old, no prior criminal record. He sat across from me and studied me for a moment. "Do you know why you're here, Caleb?" Because Officer Zipkin said I facilitated drug transactions." You facilitated drug transactions. I helped my friend get drugs for his brother. Detective Martinez sighed. Caleb, I'll be straightforward with you. You don't have a friend named Dan. Officer Zipkin is a 22-year-old police officer, working undercover to help us identify dealers at your school. But we played video games together, I said, knowing how pathetic it sounded. He came to my house. We talked about books. All part of his job. His job was to gain your trust so that you would help him connect with drug suppliers, so he never cared about me. Martinez looked at me with something that could have been pity. Caleb, you facilitated the sale of thousands of dollars in illegal drugs for a law enforcement officer. That's multiple federal charges of conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. How many years in prison? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You're potentially facing 37 years in federal prison. 37 years. I hadn't even lived that long. I don't understand, I said, rocking back and forth in the chair. Self-regulating autistic behavior I do when extremely stressed. Stop that, Martinez said sharply. You're not a child. You're 18, which means you're an adult in the eyes of the law. But I didn't know Dan was a cop. I thought I was helping my friend. Ignorance of the buyer's identity is not a legal defense. Caleb, you knew you were facilitating illegal drug transactions. For his brother, I thought it was for personal use. It doesn't matter who you thought it was for. What matters is that you consciously facilitated multiple controlled substance transactions. I continued rocking, trying to process it all. How had my first experience of friendship turned into a prison sentence? How had I gone from Caleb, the lonely kid, to Caleb, the federal dealer? Caleb, Martinez continued, let me explain your situation. You facilitated the sale of cocaine, ecstasy, OxyContin, and multiple other controlled substances. The total value of the drugs that passed through you exceeds $10,000. $10,000. I didn't even know it had been that much money. Each transaction is a separate charge. Each different substance is a separate charge. And because some of these substances are Schedule 1, the penalties are particularly severe. I have Asperger's syndrome, I said desperately. I don't understand social situations the same way other people do. Asperger's syndrome is not a legal defense for drug trafficking, but it explains why I didn't realize I was being manipulated. Martinez sighed again. Caleb, do you want to tell me exactly how this started? From your first encounter with Officer Zipkin. So I told him everything. How Dan had approached me. How we had become friends, how he had started asking for small favors that kept growing, how he always had the right words to keep me doing what he wanted, how I was so desperate for a friend that I would have done anything to maintain his approval. Interesting, Martinez said when I finished. You seem to be describing a situation of entrapment. What's entrapment? It's when law enforcement induces someone to commit a crime they otherwise would not have committed. My heart leaped with hope. That's it. That's exactly it. I never would have gotten involved with drugs if Dan hadn't manipulated me. Maybe, Martinez said. But entrapment is very difficult to prove. Especially when the defendant is technically an adult and there are multiple transactions over several months. So there's no hope. I didn't say that. But you'll need a good lawyer. And even with a good lawyer, this will be an uphill battle. Martinez stood to leave, then turned back to me. Caleb, one last thing. Are you sure you never suspected that Dan could be a police officer? Were there never moments when you thought something was wrong? I thought about all the signs I had ignored. The constant questions, the excess money, the legal knowledge, the lack of personal details. I think part of me knew something was wrong, I admitted. But I wanted a friend so badly that I ignored every sign. Martinez nodded. That's what makes cases like this so complicated. The victim is often also the perpetrator. After he left, I was alone in the room again. Through the small window, I could see my parents talking to a man in a suit in the parking lot. My father looked furious, gesturing wildly. My mother was crying. I had broken their hearts. I had brought shame to our family, all because I wanted a friend. A few hours later, my parents were allowed to see me. When the door opened and I saw their faces, my dad trying to be strong, my mom with red eyes from crying, I completely broke down. Mom, Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. My mother hugged me as I cried, rocking me the way she did when I was little and having meltdowns. Caleb, honey, we'll get through this, she whispered. We'll find a way. I just wanted a friend, I sobbed. I just wanted someone to like me. We like you, my father said, his voice breaking. We love you, and we'll fight for you. But while they talked about lawyers and appeals and legal strategies, all I could think about was one thing: Dan never existed. My first experience of friendship, the best months of my social life, the first time I ever felt accepted by a peril of it, had been a carefully constructed lie to turn me into a criminal. And the most painful part wasn't even the prison I was facing. It was knowing I had been so naive, so desperate, so easy to manipulate. It was knowing that I might never be able to trust anyone again. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings with lawyers, phone calls from journalists, and my parents' desperate attempts to understand how the legal system worked. The first lawyer we consulted was a local criminal defense attorney named Robert Chen. He was competent. But after hearing my story, he was brutally honest about our chances. Caleb, the truth is that you committed the crimes you're being charged with, he said during our first meeting. You consciously facilitated drug transactions. The fact that you were manipulated makes it morally complicated, but not legally irrelevant. But he was using my disability against me, my mother protested. Asperger's syndrome is a recognized disability, but it is not a legal defense for federal drug crimes, Chen explained. Courts are very reluctant to accept developmental disabilities as justifications for criminal activity and entrapment, my father asked. Entrapment is possible but difficult to prove. We'd have to show that Caleb would never have gotten involved with drugs without the officer's manipulation. Given that the transactions continued for months, and that Caleb actively recruited multiple sources, this will be challenging. Chen paused and looked at me with genuine sympathy. Caleb, I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm just being realistic about what we're facing. The federal justice system is not known for its compassion, especially in drug cases. We left Chen's office feeling defeated. $50,000 in legal fees for a defense that probably wouldn't work. It was my mother who suggested we seek a lawyer specializing in disability rights. There has to be someone who understands how Caleb's condition made him vulnerable, she said. After several calls, we found Mark Thompson, a San Francisco attorney who had represented other young people with developmental disabilities in criminal cases. When we spoke with him on the phone, he immediately understood the situation in a way Chen hadn't. This is a classic case of law enforcement preying on a vulnerable person, Thompson said. Asperger's syndrome makes Caleb particularly susceptible to the type of social manipulation Officer Zipkin employed. "Do you think we have a chance?" my father asked. "We have a fighting chance. It won't be easy, and it won't be cheap. But there is precedent for defenses based on the vulnerability of people with disabilities." Thompson's fees were even higher than Chun's $75,000. "My parents didn't have that kind of money, but they decided to mortgage our house to pay for my defense." "Caleb, you're our son," my mother said when expressing guilt over the cost. "We would do anything for you." Thompson flew to Riverside the following week to meet me in person. He was a tall, thin man in his early 50s, with gray hair and a gentle way of speaking that immediately made me feel more comfortable. "Caleb," he said during our first meeting, "I want you to understand that you are a victim in this case as much as you are a defendant." "But I committed the crimes," I said. "I facilitated the drug transactions." "You were manipulated by a trained professional who specifically exploited your neurological vulnerabilities," Thompson replied. "That doesn't erase what happened, but it provides important context." Thompson spent hours with me, learning about my condition, my social history, and how my need for acceptance had been weaponized against me. "Caleb, people with Asperger's syndrome often struggle with ambiguous social situations," he explained. "You tend to interpret interactions literally, trust people who show interest, and have difficulty detecting hidden intentions." "That's exactly it," I said. "Dan said we were friends, so I believed we were friends, and because you had never had a close friendship before, you had no experience recognizing when you were being manipulated." Thompson was building a defense based on multiple legal theories. First, entrapment, the argument that I would never have gotten involved with drugs without Zipkin's manipulation. Second, coercion, the argument that my psychological need to maintain the friendship constituted a form of coercion. Third, diminished capacity, the argument that my neurological condition made me less capable of understanding the implications of my actions. "None of these theories is a guarantee," Thompson warned me, "but together they create a compelling argument that you were unfairly exploited." As Thompson worked on the legal strategy, something unexpected happened. My story began attracting media attention. It started with the local newspaper, but quickly spread to national outlets. Rolling Stone, CNN, the New York Times all wanted to cover the autistic boy used by police as an unwitting informant. At first, my parents were hesitant about media exposure. "Caleb has already been through enough trauma," my mother said. But Thompson saw the potential. "Public pressure can be our greatest ally," he explained. "If we can get people to see Caleb as a victim rather than a criminal, it could influence both the prosecution and a potential jury." The first major interview was with a Rolling Stone journalist named Sarah Martinez. She flew to Riverside and spent an entire day with me and my family, trying to understand not just what had happened, but who I was as a person. "Caleb," she said during our interview, "what do you want people to understand about your story?" "I want them to know that young people like me on the autism spectrum are vulnerable in ways non-autistic people may not understand," I said. "The police used my disability against me. What would you say to other young people who might be in similar situations? If someone you just met is asking you to do things that don't feel right, talk to your parents or a trusted adult. And remember, real friends don't ask you to break the law." The Rolling Stone article, titled "The Entrapment of Caleb Rivers," was published 3 months after my arrest. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly, I was receiving letters of support from all over the country. Disability rights organizations spoke about my case. Autistic activists were using my story to illustrate how people on the spectrum can be exploited. But not all attention was positive. Online comments were often cruel. He knew drugs were illegal. 18 is an adult, disability or not. Criminals always have excuses. Reading those comments was devastating, but Thompson reminded me that public opinion was not the same as the legal system. "Caleb, our battle is in the courtroom, not online," he said. "Focus on what we can control." What we could control was building the strongest possible case. Thompson brought in Asperger's specialists to evaluate me and testify about how my condition made me particularly vulnerable to manipulation. He found legal precedents in similar cases, though none were exactly like mine. More importantly, he began uncovering troubling details about Operation Glasshouse itself. "Caleb, did you know you weren't the only target of Zipkin's operation?" Thompson told me one day. "What do you mean?" "Zipkin worked undercover at multiple schools in the Riverside area. And at each school, he specifically targeted vulnerable students, seeing people with developmental disabilities, students with troubled home lives, socially isolated boys. It was disturbing. It meant my case wasn't isolated. Zipkin had systematically preyed on vulnerable youth." Thompson also discovered that I wasn't the youngest of Zipkin's targets. "Caleb, there are at least 3 other cases where Zipkin targeted underage students. A 16-year-old boy, 2 17-year-old girls. Were they facing federal charges too? 2 were prosecuted as adults. 1 was sent to juvenile rehabilitation. The idea that children younger than me had been subjected to the same treatment made me furious in a way I had never felt before. Zipkin hadn't just destroyed my life, he had made a pattern of it. "We have to stop him," I said. "That's the idea," Thompson replied. "If we can expose Zipkin's pattern of conduct, it significantly strengthens our entrapment defense." As we prepared for trial, I tried to rebuild my life day by day. School was over. I technically graduated, though there was no ceremony for me. College plans were indefinitely on hold. My social life, already non-existent, became completely isolated. But for the first time, I began to understand that maybe it wasn't my fault. Maybe I wasn't just a naive kid who made stupid choices. Maybe I was a victim of a system that had lost its moral compass. And maybe, just maybe, I could turn my pain into something that would help other vulnerable youth avoid what I had gone through. The trial was scheduled to begin in January 2013, 8 months after my arrest. Those months had been an emotional roller coaster of legal preparation, media attention, and attempts to maintain some semblance of a normal life. Thompson had built a multi-layered defense strategy. The core of our argument was that I had been a victim of entrapment, that Officer Zipkin had induced me to commit crimes I would never have committed without his careful manipulation and exploitation of my neurological vulnerabilities. Caleb Thompson explained during one of our preparation sessions. "The key to our defense is making the jury understand not just what you did, but why you did it. They need to see that your actions were a direct result of sophisticated psychological manipulation." To support this, Thompson had assembled an impressive team of expert witnesses. There was Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a psychologist specializing in Asperger's syndrome, who would testify about how my condition made me particularly susceptible to social manipulation. There was Dr. James Wright, an expert in police interrogation techniques, who would explain how Zipkin had used typical informant recruitment methods on me, and there were several other young people who had been targeted by Zipkin at different schools. But the prosecution also had a strong case. Federal Prosecutor Williams had made it clear that they would see my Asperger's syndrome as irrelevant. Rivers committed serious federal crimes, Williams told the press. He knowingly facilitated the sale of thousands of dollars in illegal drugs. Disability is no excuse for criminal activity. A few weeks before the trial, the prosecution made a plea deal offer. They're offering 5 years of probation and 100 hours of community service in exchange for a guilty plea to simple possession, Thompson told me. Does that mean a criminal record? Yes, but it means avoiding federal prison. My parents were divided. My mother thought we should accept the 5 years of probation were far better than decades in prison. My father thought we should fight. Accepting a deal would be admitting I had done something wrong. What do you think? I asked Thompson. Honestly, Caleb, it's a tough decision. A trial is always a risk. Juries are unpredictable, especially in federal drug cases. But if we won, you would be completely exonerated. I thought for several days. The idea of pleading guilty for something I had done only because I had been manipulated made me sick. But the idea of spending decades in federal prison terrified me. Finally, I made my decision. We go to trial, I said. I'm not going to plead guilty for being manipulated. Thompson smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. The first day of trial was surreal. The federal courthouse in Los Angeles was in Pasadena, massive building of marble and dark wood that seemed designed to make people like me feel small and insignificant. There were journalists outside, TV cameras, even some protesters holding signs about disability rights. My story had become national, and my trial was seen as a test of how the justice system treated people with developmental disabilities. Jury selection took 2 days. Thompson wanted jurors who could understand concepts of vulnerability and manipulation. Williams wanted jurors focused on facts and personal responsibility. When we finally began with opening statements, Williams went straight to the point. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, this case is about choices. The defendant, Caleb Rivers, made conscious choices. He chose to facilitate the sale of illegal drugs. He chose to connect traffickers with buyers. He chose to ignore federal law multiple times over several months. Williams continued for 20 minutes, painting a picture of me as a young adult who knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. Then it was Thompson's turn. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, this is not a case about choices. This is a case about predation. It is a case about an experienced police officer who deliberately targeted a vulnerable young person, exploited his neurological disabilities, and manipulated him into committing crimes he would never have considered on his own. Thompson spent half an hour explaining Asperger's syndrome to the jury, helping them understand how my condition made me particularly susceptible to the type of manipulation Zipkin had employed. Caleb Rivers did not choose to be a drug dealer, Thompson concluded. Caleb Rivers chose to have a friend. And that choice was weaponized against him by a system that was supposed to protect him. The first week of trial was dominated by prosecution testimony. They called Zipkin to testify about the operation, and it was disturbing to hear him describe our friendship in purely tactical terms. Rivers was an ideal target, Zipkin testified. He was socially isolated, eager for acceptance. and showed clear signs of developmental challenges that made him more susceptible to direction. Did you feel comfortable targeting a young person with disabilities? Thompson asked during cross-examination. I was doing my job, Zipkin replied. Rivers was facilitating illegal drug sales. My job was to stop that, even if that meant exploiting his disability. Objection, Williams said. Leading the witness. Sustained, the judge responded. Thompson rephrased. Officer Zipkin, did you receive any training on how to interact with people with developmental disabilities? Not specifically. Were you aware that Caleb had Asperger's syndrome before beginning the operation? Zipkin hesitated. It became apparent during our interactions. And when it became apparent, did it change your approach in any way? No. My job was to collect evidence of criminal activity, even from a vulnerable young person with a disability. Objection sustained, but the damage was done. The jury had heard Zipkin admit that he knew about my condition and chose to exploit it anyway. The prosecution also brought Tyler and Marcus to testify. Both had made plea deals in exchange for cooperation, and their testimonies were devastating for my case. Caleb knew exactly what he was doing, Tyler testified. He came to me asking for drugs multiple times. It wasn't like he was tricked into it. During cross-examination, Thompson established that Tyler had accepted a plea deal that significantly reduced his sentence. Mr. Tyler, how many years of prison were you facing before your deal? 15 years. And after the deal? 2 years of probation. So you have a significant incentive to cooperate with the prosecution, I guess. And you would say anything to avoid prison. Objection. Sustained. When it was our turn to present our defense, Thompson started with me. I was nervous about testifying. Speaking in public had always been difficult for me, and this wasn't just public. It was a federal courtroom with my future at stake. Caleb, Thompson began, can you tell the jury about your social experience before meeting Dan Zipkin? I didn't have friends, I said simply. I spent all lunch periods alone. I was never invited to parties or social events. I was essentially invisible at school. How did that make you feel? Lonely. Like, profoundly lonely. I would go home every day wishing someone, anyone, would want to spend time with me. So when Dan approached you, how did you respond? I was overwhelmed. For the first time, someone seemed genuinely interested in me as a person. Someone wanted to be my friend. I testified for 3 hours, explaining how Zipkin had gradually built trust, exploited my need for acceptance, and how I never suspected our friendship was anything but genuine. Caleb, Thompson asked, would you ever have gotten involved with drugs if Dan hadn't approached you? Never. I never had any interest in drugs. I was raised to believe drugs were dangerous, and I never wanted to try them. Then why did you help Dan get drugs? Because I thought he was my friend. And you do anything to help a friend. During cross-examination, Williams was aggressive. Mr. Rivers, you knew drugs were illegal, correct? Yes, sir. And you knew that buying and selling drugs could result in prison time. I knew drugs were bad, but I didn't really think about legal consequences. You didn't think about legal consequences when you were handling thousands of dollars worth of illegal substances. I wasn't thinking about the money or the substances. I was thinking about helping my friend. But you knew your friend was asking you to break the law. I hesitated. This was a question I'd been dreading. I knew that getting drugs wasn't legal, but I thought it was like underage drinking or something, like something young people sometimes do, not something that could destroy my life. So you admit you consciously chose to break the law. I chose to help someone I thought cared about me. Williams spent another 30 minutes trying to get me to admit I was fully aware of what I was doing and chose to do it anyway. It was brutal, but Thompson had prepared me well. After my testimony, Thompson brought in our expert witnesses. Dr. Martinez explained Asperger's syndrome to the jury in detail, focusing on how it affects social understanding and vulnerability to manipulation. People with Asperger's syndrome often have what we call theory of mind deficits. She testified, they have difficulty understanding that other people might have hidden motives, or might be deceiving them. Would this make Caleb particularly vulnerable to the type of manipulation employed by Officer Zip? Absolutely. Someone like Caleb, who had never had a close friend before, would be particularly susceptible to this type of social exploitation. Dr. Wright, the expert in police interrogation techniques, was equally effective. Officer Zipkin used classic informant recruitment techniques on Caleb, he testified. Building trust, creating dependency, gradually escalating requests, using emotional manipulation. These are sophisticated psychological techniques. Are these techniques designed to work on vulnerable populations? Yes, they're specifically designed to exploit psychological vulnerabilities. Thompson also brought in 2 other young people who had been targeted by Zipkin at different schools. Their stories were remarkably similar to mine: vulnerable, isolated students who were befriended by Zipkin and gradually manipulated into facilitating drug transactions. I thought he was my first real friend, testified Maria Santos, a 17-year-old from another school. I would have done anything to keep him happy. By the end of our defense case, I felt like we had told a compelling story, but I also knew that juries are unpredictable, especially in federal drug cases. Closing arguments were held on a Friday afternoon. Williams went first, arguing that sympathy for my situation couldn't override the fact that I had committed serious federal crimes. Ladies and gentlemen, we all feel sorry for Caleb Rivers. No one wants to see a young person with disabilities get hurt. But feeling sorry for someone doesn't change the law. It doesn't change the fact that he facilitated thousands of dollars worth of illegal drug sales. Williams was effective, hitting hard on the theme of personal responsibility and the danger of creating exceptions to criminal law based on disabilities. Thompson's closing was passionate and personal. Caleb Rivers sits before you today, not as a criminal, but as a victim of a system that lost its moral compass. He was targeted specifically because of his vulnerabilities, befriended by a professional trained in psychological manipulation, and used as a pawn in an operation that had lost sight of its original purpose. Thompson spent 40 minutes walking the jury through every aspect of the case, showing how Zipkin had systematically exploited my vulnerabilities. Caleb chose to trust someone who showed him kindness. That choice was weaponized against him by people who should have been protecting him. Don't compound that injustice by making him pay for crimes he was manipulated into committing. After closing arguments, the judge gave the jury their instructions and sent them to deliberate. Jury deliberation in criminal cases can take anywhere from hours to days. In our case, it took 4 days. 4 days of waiting, pacing, unable to eat or sleep. 4 days of wondering if I would be going to prison for decades or going home to try to rebuild my life. On Wednesday morning of the 5th day, we got word that the jury had reached a verdict. Sitting in that courtroom, waiting for the foreman to read the verdict, was the most terrifying moment of my life. Everything I had been through, the manipulation, the betrayal, the media attention, the legal battle, it all came down to this moment. On the count of conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, the foreman read, "We find the defendant not guilty." I felt my knees go weak. Not guilty. After everything, after all the fear and uncertainty, I was going home. But the foreman wasn't finished. On the count of facilitating drug transactions, he continued, "We find the defendant guilty." Guilty. The word hit me like a physical blow. I was convicted of a federal felony. Thompson had warned me this might happen, that the jury might find a compromise verdict, convicting me on some charges but not others. But hearing it was still devastating. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 months later. Under federal guidelines, I was looking at a minimum of 2 years in prison, possibly more. As we left the courthouse, I was surrounded by reporters shouting questions. I couldn't process what had happened. I had been vindicated in part. The jury had found that there was enough doubt about whether I had truly conspired to distribute drugs. But I had also been convicted of a serious crime. "Caleb, how do you feel about the verdict?" a reporter shouted. I looked into the camera, still in shock. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," I said. "I just wanted a friend." The 2 months between the verdict and sentencing were surreal. I wasn't in prison, but I wasn't free either. I was in a legal limbo, waiting to find out if I would spend the next years of my life behind bars. Media coverage had intensified after the verdict. My story had become a national symbol of the justice system's failures. When it came to people with disabilities, civil rights organizations used my case to argue for reforms in how police conducted undercover operations. Autistic activists saw me as a martyr for a greater cause. But for me, it was still personal and devastating. "Caleb," my mother said one morning as we had breakfast in silence, "how are you feeling about all this?" It was an impossible question to answer. How do you feel when you discover your first experience of friendship was an elaborate lie? How do you process being used as a weapon against other vulnerable youth? How do you move forward when you can't trust your own judgment of people? "I don't know," I said honestly. "Some days I feel angry, other days I just feel broken." The anger was new to me. Before all this, I rarely felt real anger. Frustration, yes. Sadness, certainly. But this anger that burned in the stomach, that was new. I was angry at Zipkin for using me. I was angry at the police system that thought it was acceptable to target vulnerable children. I was angry at myself for being so naive, so desperate for acceptance. But mostly, I was angry because Dan had seemed so real. That was what hurt the most. Not just that I had been betrayed, but that I had experienced something beautiful, only to discover it never existed. Those months with Dan were the first in my life when I felt normal, accepted, valued. And it had all been a carefully orchestrated performance. Thompson continued working on my case, preparing for the sentencing hearing. In federal cases, sentencing is not automatic. The judge has some discretion within federal guidelines. Thompson was hoping to convince the judge to give me probation instead of prison. "Caleb, we'll have one last chance to tell your story," he said. "At the sentencing hearing, you can speak directly to the judge. You can explain how this affected you, what you've learned, why you don't pose a danger to society. The idea of speaking in public again made me anxious, but I knew it was my best chance. Meanwhile, I was trying to figure out how to move forward with my life. College plans were on hold. Which university would accept a convicted federal offender? Job prospects looked grim, for the same reasons. My future, already uncertain due to my social challenges, now seemed completely blocked. But something unexpected was happening. People were reaching out to mother autistic youth who had been manipulated. Parents of children with developmental disabilities, lawyers working on similar cases. One letter particularly touched me. It was from a mother in Texas whose 16-year-old son had been the target of a similar police operation. "Dear Caleb," she wrote, "my son Michael has Asperger's syndrome, just like you. Last month, a student approached him at school and started asking for favors. Thanks to your story, we recognized the signs and alerted the school. It turned out to be an undercover officer. Your courage in speaking publicly may have saved my son. Thank you." Letters like this helped me realize that my pain could have a purpose. If my experience could help other vulnerable youth avoid what I went through, then maybe it hadn't been in vain. A few weeks before the sentencing hearing, Thompson received an unexpected call. "Caleb, you won't believe it," he said. "The prosecution wants to renegotiate." "What do you mean?" "Public pressure is working. They're offering 1 year of probation and community service. No prison." It was a tempting offer, but something in me resisted. "Thompson, if I accept this, I'm still admitting I'm guilty, right?" "Technically, yes. The jury's verdict stands. Then I won't accept. If I'm going to be considered guilty, I want it to be by a judge's decision, not a deal I made out of fear." Thompson smiled. "You've grown a lot during this process, Caleb." The sentencing hearing took place on a cold March morning. The courtroom was packed. My parents, journalists, activists on both sides, and several people I didn't recognize, but who apparently cared about the outcome of my case. Prosecutor Williams spoke first, arguing that I deserved prison despite my condition. "Your Honor, while we may feel sympathy for the defendant's circumstances, he has been convicted of a serious federal crime. Allowing developmental disabilities to become excuses for criminal activity would set a dangerous precedent." Then it was Thompson's turn. He spent 20 minutes recounting my full story, my isolated childhood, my struggles with social interactions, how Zipkin had systematically exploited my vulnerabilities. "Your Honor, Caleb Rivers is not a criminal. He is a victim who was turned into a perpetrator by a system that lost sight of its fundamental mission to serve and protect." Finally, it was my turn to speak. I stood and looked at the judge, Judge Bradley, an older man with white hair and kind eyes who had presided over the entire trial. "Your Honor," I began, my voice trembling, "I cannot change what I did. I facilitated drug transactions, even though I did not fully understand the consequences. But I want you to understand why." I spent the next 10 minutes speaking about my life before Dan, how my condition made me vulnerable, and how the psychological manipulation had worked. "I am not asking you for leniency," I said. "I am asking you to understand that people like me need protection, not exploitation. And I promise I will use my experience to help other vulnerable youth." When I finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Bradley studied me for a long moment. "Mr. Rivers," he finally said, This has been one of the most disturbing cases I have presided over in my career. Not because of the crimes committed, but because of the circumstances that led to them. He paused, consulting his notes. It is clear to this court that you were the victim of systematic manipulation by a trained officer who exploited your developmental vulnerabilities. While this does not erase the crimes for which you were convicted, it provides essential context. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. Therefore, this court sentences you to 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory participation in programs raising awareness about the rights of people with disabilities. No prison, I was going home. But Judge Bradley wasn't finished. Additionally, this court strongly recommends that law enforcement agencies reconsider their tactics when dealing with vulnerable populations. What happened here must not be repeated. When we left the courthouse, I was in shock. 2 years of probation felt like nothing compared to the decades in prison I could have faced. Outside, a small crowd waited. Journalists, activists, and people who had followed my story. A reporter shoved a microphone in my face. "Caleb, how do you feel about the sentence?" I thought for a moment. How did I feel? "I'm grateful," I said. "I'm grateful that I'm not going to prison. But most of all, I'm grateful for a chance to turn something terrible into something meaningful." "What do you mean?" "I want to work to protect other vulnerable youth. I want to make sure no other child goes through what I went through." I am writing this in 2018, 5 years after my sentencing. Much has changed, but some wounds have yet to fully heal. I completed my probation without incident. I turned the 200 hours of community service into much more now. I regularly work with organizations advocating for the rights of people with disabilities and criminal justice reform. I managed to get into college after 2 years, USC. Ironically, the same university where Dan claimed his brother attended, accepted my application after I wrote an essay about my experience. I am graduating in psychology, focusing on policy development to protect vulnerable populations. Operation Glasshouse has become a national case study on the dangers of undercover police operations in schools. Several cities have reviewed their policies. Officer Zipkin was reassigned to administrative roles and never worked undercover again. But the most important changes were personal. I've learned to trust my judgment again, though it's a slow process. I've made some real friends in college, people who accept me with my odd mannerisms, my different way of processing the world, my complicated history. I am still autistic. I still struggle with ambiguous social situations. I still prefer predictable routines and direct conversations. But now I understand that these are not flaws that need fixing, they are differences that can be strengths in the right context. Sometimes I still dream about Dan. In these dreams, our friendship is real. We play video games, talk about books, laugh at jokes only we understand. I wake from these dreams with a sense of loss that still surprises me with its intensity. But I also wake knowing that, although Dan never existed, the capacity for friendship within me is real. The vulnerability that made me a target also makes me capable of deep and authentic connections. My message to other young people like me is simple. Your difference is not a flaw. Your need for connection is not weakness. But learn from my experience. True friends don't ask you to break the law, no matter how desperate you are for acceptance. And to the systems that are supposed to protect us, vulnerable people deserve protection, not exploitation. When you use our differences against us, you are not serving justice. You are perpetuating injustice. My name is Caleb Rivers. I am autistic. I am a survivor, and I am stronger than I ever imagined I could be. This is my story. It is not a story about drugs, or crime, or even betrayal. It is a story about vulnerability, manipulation, and the redemptive power of turning pain into purpose. The friend who never existed taught me lessons I will never forget. And although the price was high, those lessons are helping me build real connections and protect others who, like me, just wanted to belong. Ultimately, this is a story about hope. Because if someone like me betrayed, manipulated, and almost destroyed by the system can find a path to healing and purpose, then there is hope for all of us. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for seeing my humanity through the mistakes I made. And thank you for remembering that behind every headline, every criminal statistic, every legal case, there is a real person trying to find their place in the world. My journey continues. And for the first time in a long time, I am hopeful about where it will take me.
Note: this story is based on the real-life events of Jesse Snodgrass and Operation Glasshouse in 2012. Some names and details have been altered, but the central elements of the story, the manipulation of a young autistic man by law enforcement authorities, are factually accurate. Jesse's story has become a paradigmatic case in discussions about disability rights, police ethics, and criminal justice system reform. If you or someone you know is on the autism spectrum and feels vulnerable to social manipulation, please seek support from local disability rights organizations or mental health professionals specializing in autism. #TheFriendWhoNeverExisted